you going to teach us anything?
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right. You got it!
Hello and welcome to this episode of Atomi Brainwaves. I'm Tom and I'll be stepping in as your guest host for this very special episode we have today. Today we're recording at Atomi headquarters. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Atomi is an online teaching and learning platform for high school students in Australia and the UK. We produce syllabus-specific content in the form of videos, interactive quizzes, and online tests and assessments. And we also have a very advanced analytics platform that helps schools understand where the students might need a little bit of extra help and where students might be struggling. So in this episode today, we've got a very special guest that we've lined up, which is Briony Scott. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
Yes. So Briony is the headmaster or principal of Wenona, which is one of Sydney's elite private girls' schools, just ahead of, just up north of Sydney by about 5-10 minutes from the city. Briony's been the head of a couple of different girls' schools now and a couple of different schools. So I think about 20 years sitting at the helm of a school in Sydney. So hopefully today we'll get lots of interesting insights.
Oh, I'll try.
To kick that off, do you mind telling us a little bit about your story and how you ended up becoming the headmaster of Wenona?
Well, I ended up, after I left school, doing agriculture at Sydney University, and that was simply a product of not having a clue what I wanted to do with my life. So I opened up the guide to different degrees and leapt over accounting and landed on agriculture and thought, well, that's an applied science degree. And did that. I was really bad at it. By third year, I still didn't know quite how to make hay and what that meant. So I ended up majoring in education in my fourth year, more as an escape route, if you will, from...
It's quite a sidestep.
Yeah, thank you very much. Especially given that I grew up on the ocean, learning how to dive and with the fishes. So it was one of those things where you walk through a door that wasn't really a great fit for me. But from there, went into education, teaching agriculture and maths and science, which I absolutely loved. And from there, it just kind of, the career grew by mistake more than by design.
So what school did you first step into?
Well, prac teaching-wise, the first school I ever stepped in was Galston High School, which is an amazingly beautiful high school up in the north of Sydney. And they had the great grounds and, these kids were planting vegetables and fruit and looking after animals long before it became really kind of trendy, I guess, to do so. But I loved it. It was a country school that was really in the city, and I learnt a lot just by watching the teachers and how they organised their lives and how they managed their day. It was a great experience.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it's been quite a step from something like that to sort of the heart of the city, I guess, or, a much more urban environment. Yeah.
I've moved closer. So from there I went to a school that no longer exists. It was an Anglican boys' school, and that was an amazing experience. So it was a start-up school, once again, on the Northern Beaches. Eventually it merged with St Luke's, so it was Peninsula Anglican Boys' School, and that merged with St Luke's. And then what did I do after that? Then I went and worked as a systems analyst with Olivetti International. So I went overseas and did some work. I think at the boys' school I was promoted quite quickly, as you often are in those startup schools, to a year, well, they call it a year mistress, which I thought was a really badly named position. So we kind of quickly recalibrated there. But I realised that I needed to get out and have some other experiences other than schools and education. So I worked with Olivetti International for a number of years, then came home and had children. I didn't go back into paid workforce for about 11 years.
Wow.
And then when I did, I went and worked for another type of start-up Christian school. The primary school had been well established, but I joined in the senior school and helped them take through their first year 12. That was Oxford Falls Grammar. And then Then I was Roseville. Then I was principal at Roseville for a while, at Roseville College for 5 years, which I loved. It was a girls' school. And then from there, Wenona.
Wow, that's there's not many teachers that manage to take a sidestep out into the corporate world for a while. What was that like, taking the? Look,
I absolutely loved it because sometimes I think if you're only in education, you think that nobody understands quite how hard you work and Then you get out in the corporate and you realise actually people work exceptionally hard and for long periods of time and without quite the break that teachers have. But equally, I was aware in the corporate world that they really had no idea how schools worked. So it was really good to be able to have an experience in both of those environments.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, especially when we've got schools that are trying to prepare students for that corporate world as well, and yet both those worlds seem to be quite sort of bifurcated. Most of the times in terms of the people that come in and out of them.
It's interesting too watching how many teachers are now, or people are choosing to follow teaching as a profession mid-career, who've actually engaged in other professions and have making the decision to retrain as a teacher and come into the workplace, into the school type environment. And the richness of experiences that they bring into this environment. I can see the pros and cons of both, but I personally have been deeply grateful for people who have made mid-career transitions back into education. I think we're fortunate to have those people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a great tradition of that kind of happening from the corporate level to go back to university as a lecturer, but to get people back into school as well, I think is probably a bit more of a scary proposition for some people, but it's something we need. Definitely.
I admire it enormously because it's so easy once you're on a conveyor belt to think that you can't ever get off it or you can't ever do anything differently. And so for people who make mid-career decisions, it takes great courage to make that kind of a decision, right? So I admire it because to go back and become a beginner in middle age is often very hard for us to do because we get really good at protecting ourselves and, not having to learn from scratch again. So on so many fronts, I think they add a richness to our schools that I probably didn't predict when I was younger.
There's a small irony to that as well, especially with schools as institutions that are very big advocates of lifelong learning as well. It's very easy to sort of get stuck in the grind.
Absolutely. And I think I was talking to some teachers the other day that said, when I was young and I would fall over, I'd pick myself up and I'd brush myself off and I'd just keep going. Now I'm in my mid-50s, I rarely fall over. I rarely put myself in a position where I could lose my balance and look undignified. And I wonder how much of that is like not just physical but emotional as well, that we say we're taking risks, but are we taking risks really? I think we get very conservative in our old age. Yeah,
absolutely. And I'm sure students as well, they probably see sometimes through the facade of that when we're trying to say be creative and take risks and be daring, and yet, sometimes we don't necessarily stand up to that.
Or fail forward. And you're like, really? Are we failing forward? Are we creating an environment when they do fail, we genuinely go, you know what, that's okay as long as you're learning from it?
Yeah. It's a tough problem, and it's probably not something we're gonna solve today. But hopefully, with a few more steps, hopefully we can get a little bit closer. So to dive into something of what I really wanted to discuss today, before this podcast, I may have done what's considered these days a little bit of internet stalking of your history.
Yep.
Everyone's quite Googleable these days.
That's true.
But it's great. You've actually had a lot of commentary out there on a lot of different subjects and topic areas. You've been a commentator in the Sydney Morning Herald, is that correct, for quite a while now?
Yes.
So it gave me a lot of choice in terms of what we wanted to dive into here. But one thing that I picked up on that I was really interested to chat about was this idea that you sort of spoke about in saying that people often think, especially from the outside, of schools as just academic institutions when they're so much more than that. And especially with society changing in some ways, that that schools need to be thought of more as communities and what they provide in that sense for their community as well. So I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit for us and kind of explain what you meant and what you think that means as a school, as a community.
So it's a little multifaceted. Schools used to be the centre of most communities or, village life, along with the church, and they're often one and the same. When you look at it now, families are often quite isolated. They are no longer part of extended families. Families are a lot more fractured than they used to be. People don't belong to church. They don't belong to community hubs. And so they're in a position where if they're not a part of their school community, they actually don't belong to a bigger group of people or a group that's bigger than themselves. And then on top of that, you have just this increased anxiety across the board We have leaders that we have traditionally looked to in the past where we no longer look to them for our inspiration, for our role modelling. And by that I mean leaders in the church, I mean political leaders, I mean societal leaders. They just don't exist in the form that they used to. Now, there were some real drawbacks to that model, so I'm not advocating a romantic view of the past, but I am arguing that people need to have a sense of belonging, and particularly when they're raising children, that it's actually very difficult to raise children in solo by yourself. You need to be able to bounce it off other people. It takes a village. And that village can be as eclectic and as diverse as you want it to be, but it's never healthy when it's just one parent or one family doing it against the world. And so schools become a place where increasingly we are providing education for parents, we're providing counselling for parents, and not in an offensive way or a patronising way, but in a way that goes, you know what, we're just trying to help them do life. So there's this beautiful quote that we're all just walking each other home. And when you live in that zone where you go, it's not our job to tell people how to raise their children or how to run their family. It's our job to walk alongside them while they do it and to support them and to encourage them. It's our job to go, you know what, I know you think your child's really obnoxious and, you know, is going off the rails, but in actual fact, they're just a normal kid and they're fine. Like, you don't like the behaviour at the moment, but they're getting there, you know, like they'll be all right. Bringing in a sense of normalcy that after years of helping raise thousands and thousands and thousands of adolescents, we've seen a lot, you know, and so we can talk a little bit about, well, you know, do you need to be worried? And go, well, of course, we always get worried about teenagers because that's kind of what we do. We keep an eye on them. But by and large, they grow up to be outstanding young men and women, and just helping parents hold that lightly, I think, is something that is a great honour. It's a real privilege to be able to do, and it's harder to do for parents when they're feeling so isolated and the world is such an increasingly anxious place.
Yeah, I've heard actually some interesting sort of commentary that as a lot of students' social interaction drifts more online and less sort of face-to-face as well, that, you know, it's more likely that they'll find, you know, support in a niche community as well. But even in those senses, it's decreasing the diversity of voices, views and opinions that we kind of that young people experience and have to get along with in the early stages. So I think it's sort of really interesting as a school as kind of like that still melting pot of where you have to learn to get along with sometimes people that you don't like and agree with. And
so true. And it's interesting. I mean, there are two aspects about your comment just then. One is that there's been a lot of discussion in the media about uniforms and so forth, and we're a real stickler for uniforms at our school. And it's not because I have any desire to see children have blue ribbons versus purple. I have no interest in that whatsoever. But it is the one opportunity these days where they get to be a part of something bigger than themselves, where not everything is about them. And I learned this a number of years ago with the Bali Nine when they were arrested, and watching and listening to the outcry from the Australian people to the Australian government going, what are you going to do about it? Like, step in and do something. And the government just saying, we actually can't do anything. There are some things over which we have no control. And young people have to learn that there are some things that you cannot influence, that it is not about you or how lovely a person you are. If you speed, if you go 100 kilometres in a school zone, you will get a ticket, you will get fined. And I'm not going to rescue you. I can't rescue you. It's a bigger world than just you and what you know. So the uniform concept is an interesting one because it's of no interest to me in some respects. And in another respect, I go, give me another example where it's not about them. Where they have to understand that the rules are imposed by somebody else and you have to learn to appreciate what those rules are. Yeah,
I think it's definitely hard as a high school student to appreciate what the brand of a school means, and especially afterwards, you know, after the fact. I think a lot of times that students that may have, you know, left the school and many years later they see students in those uniforms, and that actually means something to them quite
funny.
Deeply.
The brand of the school doesn't worry me in the slightest, and I'll often have, you know, parents or a student go, oh, you know, you're only doing that to protect the school, and I'm like, hello, have we ever met? Like, this is not what I'm saying here. the reputation of the school, with some obvious exceptions if you're going to be really silly, will survive the test of time. What I care about is what it means when you go, this rule has to apply to everyone else, but it doesn't have to apply to me or to my child. And you go, well, actually it does. So it's not about the rule per se, it's about the concept that not everything is about you. And if you live in a huge extended family, then you learn that, right? You learn that actually you may not want this, but granddad who's got no teeth, actually we're going to serve it up because he wants it. Like you learn to give and take in a way that if you're not in a school environment, a school community, I don't know where you learn that so easily anymore, because it's like, well, what do you want? I'll give you individual meals. Everyone in the family gets an individual meal, that thinking that we will cater for your individual wants and desires. I'm not sure that makes for happy adults.
Yeah, compromise is something that's quite hard to learn, but probably one of the most valuable skills if you can negotiate it carefully in later life.
Absolutely, and understand that life is give and take, and that it's not all going to go your way, and nobody owes you a thing. And so what are you going to do about that? The other comment you made about social media, I think it is interesting watching young people go more on social media, and the benefit, the huge, I'm not as worried about them as many people are, because I don't see them certainly in our environment, walking away from the face-to-face or the social interactions. That still matters an enormous amount to them. I do like the fact that social media allows them to gravitate to people who think maybe like them, which normalises it, because young people, particularly adolescents, are very quick to go, nobody understands me, I'm the exception, no one is like me. Like, well, actually they are. There's a whole bunch of people who are like you. Now, that obviously has its pros and cons. If it's a functional community, it's fantastic. If it's dysfunctional, if it's a child who's suffering from anorexia and they're on a website and all it is they're talking about the benefits of anorexia, you can see the negativity of it. But it supplements their view of the world. It doesn't have to replace their view of the world.
Yeah, and I think that's probably, I guess one of the great concerns is just that the opacity of it. Like, as parents, it used to be a little bit clearer to sort of know roughly who your children were talking to, and roughly the sorts of communities they were involved in. And now there's just sort of, I guess, that one step removed as well, which probably gives a little bit of anxiety to parents as well. And
the anxiety is real. Yeah, I'll give you that one. I don't know that we have ever really known what's gone on in the life of a young person, and an example of that is why we've had to have this Royal Commission. We thought we knew. We thought the environment was a certain way and it was a different way. Young people have their own experience of life, that we're not always privy to. Where I do challenge the parents is by saying, well, don't sit back and then go, I know nothing about them. Don't give them the keys to the car and then go, I don't understand why it crashed. If you want to understand about social media, get on social media. There is nothing inherently, I know that the expression digital native is one I disagree with profoundly. There is nothing more technologically biased around this generation than any other generation. They have just chosen to engage in it, and they've been exposed to it and they engage with it. It's been available to them. It's equally available to older people if you choose to want to know it. But if you can't stand on the sidelines and be critical, because any adolescent worth their salt is going to go, perfect, right? I'll just stay in this world, I think that there is a lot more as adults that we can do, because often young people coming into this world, they're clever, and but they're not wise. And older people, if they've lived a deliberate life, can be wise, can bring that wisdom. And I think we need that more than ever. We don't need adults stepping back going, I don't know about this generation. Now is not the time to back off.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Well, in this sort of, just to loop us back to community a little bit, one thing that I wanted to ask you about is, obviously, if this is something that's definitely a major concern for you at your school, what's the type of things that you are doing to actively build that kind of community support, to sort of drive that? I think this is something that principals of all schools have always known, and are increasingly recognising their role in what we're doing in terms of keeping people connected in a disconnected world, which it is a very disconnected world. So for me, it's not
even just about my school. It's when I look at all schools across all sectors, how hard principals and teachers are working at creating a counter-narrative or a counter-cultural perspective to what's happening out there. And by this I mean that traditionally schools used to replicate society, and so you'd get these little people and you'd educate them with the ways of the world, and you'd give them everything they needed, and it was kind of like this metaphorical baton that was passed from one generation to the next. I look at it now and I think actually schools are almost countercultural. We look at what's out there, we look at the leadership, and I'm not talking politically, although it manifests in the political arena. I'm talking in every form about what makes a good man or what makes a good woman, and how do we teach about character when in the media and in the news and everything having character is like the lowest of the low, like we don't go there. And so I look at this and I think schools have almost become countercultural, and we've said, look, we know what's going out there on the news and in the media, but here in our school, in our community, this is what matters. You actually do need to be able to say sorry. Now, in my experience, I mean, you can count on one hand the number of adults who can genuinely apologise, hand on heart and go, I'm so sorry. And yet for young people, we say to them, yep, I had two beautiful kids today who were just acting like jerks about something. And I was like, can we at least agree that you blew it? Yeah, yep, completely. So what do you do now? Well, now we have to go and apologise to this. But too right you do. All right, let me know when that's done, They learn how to act in ways that will lead them to being good men and good women. So that sense of being countercultural, of creating a community or an environment that just doesn't behave the way everyone in the world is behaving, I think has become really more important than ever.
And is that more like an explicit action that you sort of set that out, or is that sort of more implied in the way that you actually set an example for the kids?
It's both, but you have to be explicit. So, there's this great thing that, that children won't imitate what you say, they'll imitate what you do, and that is profoundly and utterly true. So our words carry a disproportionate weight and our actions carry a disproportionate weight. And they look to adults in their world all the time, constantly looking with them for cues as to how to behave, how to react in a situation. And they look and they go, okay, so this has happened, this is how I behave, and this is what I do. At the same time, you have to be explicit because sometimes that path is not an easy path, and so it's easy to kind of wriggle around it. And it's basic stuff, If I'm talking, I don't want 27 other people talking at the same time, but when you talk, everyone will be quiet too. It's learning how to say please. It's learning how to say thank you. It's stuff that we go, oh, surely everyone knows how to do that. And I'm like, No, they really don't. You have to be explicit about what courtesy looks like. So in our school, we have two things that are non-negotiable. So one is the uniform. Once again, not because of the uniform, but because it's a part of something bigger than you are. And the second one is courtesy. You don't get to pick and choose how you speak to someone. You speak to them with grace, with kindness. You can be firm. I don't want you being a doormat. I don't want you being aggressive. I don't want you being passive-aggressive. You need to learn how to be assertive, but you can do that well.
Yeah, I think it definitely goes to the core of communication is that, even if you can think of your most angry and upset thought that you want to scream at someone, if you can find a way to express that in a way that they can actually connect with and communicate, then you're much more likely to.
And I think if that's not explicitly taught in schools, I'm not convinced it is explicitly taught anywhere anymore.
Yeah, definitely. And at the end of the day, I think fundamentally, people greatly underrate the sheer amount of time that students spend at school each day with each other. And,
yes.
We think a lot of things about whether this is the school's responsibility or the parents' responsibility. But at the end of the day, I think, you're a product of the people that you surround yourself with as much as anything else. So the more people that you can get to set a great example for students in terms of the standards they set in communicating with each other and how they treat each other, then hopefully sort of, bit by bit, that's going to end up.
And it does. Yeah. Honestly, they grow up to be amazing people. And one of the great joys of working in a K-12 school
you get to see the whole thing.
I love it, but they leave and they graduate as men and women who are just extraordinary. So I agree. I don't think it's about is it the parents or is it the school? I go, it's the village. So how's that working for us? What's the village look like? And perhaps as adults, before we're so quick to kind of point the finger at young people and say they're doing this and they're not doing that and they're too long on their phones and I'm like, yeah, and how's that working for you? Are we being what we want them to be? I suspect not. I think we have slightly different rules for young people as we do for ourselves.
No, well, sometimes that's everyone's got to break their own rules now and then a little bit as well.
Absolutely.
Exactly. If I'm going to sneak in a Tim Tam now and then, that's one thing. But if I'm going to write a lecture on what healthy food is, then unfortunately, that's going to show me up pretty badly there.
Again.
So speaking of graduating students, and you said that your girls are going off and doing amazing things. This was actually a point that I wanted to discuss with you. Wenona is an incredibly successful academic school. Your girls are fantastic, and they've certainly managed to achieve some incredible scores. Now, obviously, there's a lot of factors that go into that as well.
Yes.
But needless to say, obviously you have a culture of academic excellence, at least inside the cohort.
We have a culture of working hard, but not at all costs. And so there's this great line, all ships rise on a rising tide. The idea that education, women have never been as well educated as they are today. And despite its critics, education certainly in the Western world has never been as good as it's been, So with that, I think comes an extraordinary responsibility to use that education, to not view it as it is a right, but a sense of understanding that you have a responsibility with this extraordinary gift that you've been given, that millions and millions of young women would just do anything to get a fraction of it. And so there is an expectation that if you come here, that you give it your best. And I know that sounds like a Hallmark greeting card, but I actually mean it. And there are a number of times I've sat kids down going, this is a waste. Do not be here. You don't want to be here, don't. It doesn't worry me. I'll help you get anywhere else you want to go. But if you're going to come here, understand that this is a gift, is an extraordinary gift, and what do you do with that?
Yeah, I think that you sort of hinted at it there a little bit about the not at all costs, and that obviously there's certainly an incentive to do well, and that opens up opportunities thereafter in school, whether that be tertiary education or any other choice that your girls go on to. But you've said in a couple of different areas that you're not a big fan of standardized testing, and NAPLAN in particular. And NAPLAN, for those international listeners, is a standardized test that runs in essentially every couple of years, from year 3 all the way up to year 9 in Australia. And it's mostly focused on sort of core skills. I think, like some of the OECD tests would be a similar analog in terms of literacy and numeracy. But yeah, I would love to get you to sort of explain, being an academically successful school, why you think, being benchmarked like that and might not necessarily be the best thing for the girls or the teachers.
Yeah, I don't mind diagnostic testing. I think NAPLAN is a blunt instrument, so I liken it to using a butter knife for surgery. You can do it, but why would you? But I can understand absolutely standardised testing. I can understand benchmarking. I can understand individual schools being able to do what they need to do. But the concept of individualised diagnostic testing is that then does not become something that is transferable or replicable across groups or clusters of schools. So the kind of circumstances that I'm in are profoundly different than other schools that have a different dynamic and a different cultural background and have different, some of them significant social disadvantage and diversity that they're factoring in. So to hold them accountable for a blunt instrument around how their individual students are going and then compare them to other schools which are in profoundly different setups, I struggle with that. I think that's a very political decision. And most good educators I know are quite capable of working out how they can determine where their students are and where they want them to be and how they go about doing that. And if they don't, they can ask for help and get that kind of additional advice if they need to. So I do struggle with that, with the use of kind of NAPLAN testing. Even the more international tests, I don't know that anyone actually knows what they're testing here. For me, if we hit the top 10 in terms of the league tables and things like that, we will have failed as a school. We'll have somewhere along the lines, we'll have not become, at the moment we're non-selective, we will have become selective somehow other than, obviously it's a school that is financially selective because it's a private school, so parents pay fees. We have an extraordinarily diverse array of scholarships and kids who come in. But I want the full range of kids academically. I don't want just the kids who find school easy. The world is so much more than that. I want the quirky kids. I want the kids who are so creative that they can't, that's their strength and they can't do anything else. I want the kids who think that they're not academic, and I want the rich complexity.
That your school can make a difference to as well.
Well, I just want kids. I want normal people, right? Like I don't want this. Here's the thing about schools. Schools reward conforming extroverts. So kids who are just a little bit outgoing, who colour between the lines, and they are magnificent. They're magnificent to teach. The school system works for these kids, right? The problem with that conveyor belt is that that's like 1 inch wide, and the human experience is like 1 mile wide. It's such a small fraction of what life is going to throw at them, about who they are, what they're going to do with the decisions that are in front of them. I don't want kids who are cookie cutters. It's just I want the diversity because that's where the joy is, particularly in teaching. Anyone can teach this extroverted conformist. They're easy kids to teach. That's not where the huge joy is.
Yeah, I think you brought up a key point there as well in terms of what these are used for. And I think that's a really interesting question, especially when it comes to NAPLAN and even the senior assessments that students take in the end. Because a lot of the times these things are the assessments are sat, they're graded, they're marked, someone gets a mark back and we move on with our lives. They're not necessarily assessment for learning.
No. And here in Australia, we have like a final exams at the end of the year. The schools are not even allowed to know the mark that is used to determine whether they can go to university. So I liken that to a surgeon, because it's a nice easy comparison, who's asked to operate on all these patients but then not told whether they survive or, if they did survive, how they go. You're just meant to keep doing the job and you don't get the feedback. So you're not even in a position where you can refine what you need to do. On top of that, these are solely the assumption is that these marks are used to determine going into the universities. A whole heap of kids don't go to uni and make great life choices. I mean, there's more to life than that as an option. And yet there we are. The entire education system is orientated around those who will go to university. And then to top it off, you have businesses who have cottoned onto this, who are bypassing. Universities are bypassing the ATAR. The businesses are bypassing the universities. The whole system is now based on a model that may have worked well 15 or 20 years ago, but profoundly doesn't work now.
Yeah, I heard. I was reading an article earlier in this week that talked about that universities are now one of the most expensive insurance policies that a student can get. Essentially, if what they really want to do doesn't work out, or the market turns down, and they get into a point where they're looking at a job compared to another candidate, then that university degree might be the key difference between, someone being selected or getting an interview and not. But it's not necessarily the defining characteristic of success.
In fact, I would argue it's definitely not.
Exactly.
I think that sort of thinking is a very outdated way of viewing the world.
Yeah. Well, for me, certainly, I studied, mathematics, science and computer science and ended up doing something very radically different. So
and look at me, I started with agriculture.
Exactly.
Got me in education. I think trying to say to our young people that you have choice here, and you do not have to have made that choice at 18. So if you want to go and work for a couple of years, if you want to go and get a specialist, get a trade, do an apprenticeship, do whatever you want to do, and then in time you'll work out, you'll land where you want to land. But this idea that they have to have worked it out from such an early age. And I always laugh at this, even the fact that here in Australia, in New South Wales, the girls, and the students, I should say, do about 6 subjects for their final exams. And then you get into an arts degree, a general, broad-based liberal arts degree, and they have 180 choices. I'm like, how on earth do you know what you want to do, right? Like, it's just, it's just silly that they're expected to know so early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's well, we still get a lot of questions about what subject should I do, and because a lot of times the reason that they'll follow that up is because I want to do this particular major at university, and you're right. It's definitely laughable to sort of think
have fun.
Yeah, you definitely have changed your mind about a lot of things in life in between now and the next 4 or 5 years. So, and hopefully you have the confidence to change your mind along the way as well. So, the next thing that I wanted to chat to you about was Wenona being a girls' school. So obviously, there's a lot of discussion out there about education, single-sex education. The word boys' club has been used many, many times to lament private boys' schools. But obviously there's a lot of reasons why single-sex schools exist and why they've been around in the first place. But still there's a lot of criticism for them as well. So I was wondering if you could just give us your perspective on step into the hot
seat.
Yeah.
There are wings of libraries. So when people go, the research shows, I'm like, well, which wing of the library are you pointing to? Because the other wing says the exact opposite. And I've taught in co-ed and boys' schools and girls' schools and loved every single one of them. I love education. I love teaching. I think it's, from my perspective, I'm mostly teaching girls because I'm a specialist in girls. And by that, it doesn't mean that I'm brilliant with every one of them. But if you go back to your medical analogies again, we don't have an issue with people going, you know what, I'm a GP, and someone going, well, I'm a cardiologist, or, I'm a neurosurgeon. We have no problem with that. We understand that you can be a specialist in one and it doesn't detract from the other. In medicine, everyone's got an opinion in education. For me, I am very cognizant of the biases around girls and their education and their career prospects and the choices they make in life and who makes those choices for them. I'm equally cognizant, because I've worked in boys' schools and in co-ed schools, of the dynamic around the stereotypes around boys and some of the challenges that they really face in education. To say that the only way that you can deal with that is to be in a co-ed environment, and the most common line is because it's a co-ed world. And I go, well, how's that working for you? Because there's a whole heap of areas where we're still so behind and backward, and in terms of how we treat each other and how we treat and acknowledge difference. So for me in a girls' school, I work very hard on teaching, particularly the older girls, about recognising power and how to understand when power is being used against you and how you wield power and how you can do that well or not well. There's silly things there, like it is a feminist school. Like I teach them about equal rights and the fact that they shouldn't let other people make their decisions for them. But just being in a girls' school doesn't make you aware of gender inequities. Much like being in a co-ed school doesn't make you, like all of a sudden very balanced. So you can have a single-sex girls' school that's as sexist as they come and a single-sex boys' school that's deeply sexist. So the question is, you're really looking not so much, I think, for the school as to the thinking behind the school and what they're looking to address. And so for us, we work very hard. We love men, right? So there's not which quoted out of context could be a real problem, but there's not an issue here where you're going, the girls are better, but you are saying, well, actually, hold on. When I first started there, and I'm looking at the HSC results and I'm looking, okay, the English and history results were far better than the maths and science results. So it was an all-girls school, right? I go, what is that about? Are we just an all-girls school that just plays to the bias? So we introduced engineering studies, we introduced STEM, and so now we've got these kids in Year 9 who are, making prosthetic limbs and using robotics to kind of create artificial prostheses. And I look at that and I go, I know that these girls aren't all going to be engineers, but at least the choice is an informed choice. At least they're not other people aren't making that decision for them. They get to explore everything and then go, actually, this is what I like. So for many of those girls, they will go on and do English history majors and they'll be absolutely outstanding at it. But there'll also be kids who go, yeah, but I want to do this. Or the best yet, they'll be majoring in English and robotics, which of course is where that nexus is where most of the creative innovation kind of happens. So it's an interesting thing that I don't think is so, when people talk about boys' schools and girls' schools and co-ed, I think it doesn't work like that anymore. It depends on, are you aware of how you're raising these young people and the messages that they're receiving. And even now you can walk into any school anywhere and say, look, our subject's gendered, is English more for boys or for girls, and they know the theoretical answer and then they know the real answer. The theoretical answer is, it doesn't matter. The real answer is like English is girls, boys are maths, And so how we challenge that and break that down, I think remains as important as it's ever been.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that externally it looks like a simple problem. The old analogy of if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Spot on.
But obviously, and I think this has probably been a bit of a theme in our chat, is that what goes on inside of school walls and the nuance in that is much more important in terms of the individual relationships and the standards that you set with the students than the external perspective really is.
And I think it's very easy outside of education to look at everything as if it's a binary argument, and that you're either for or against, you're yes or you're no, you're black or you're white. And the reality is the exact opposite. And it's not that we don't have standards or we don't have, morals or anything like that.
We deal with people. They're not
we
machines.
We deal with people, and they are complex, and we're in a position where we're guiding and influencing, but we're not God. So we don't get to decide who they're going to be or what they're going to do. We just have to make sure that they get a really good education that allows them to make an informed choice about who they want to be and where they want to go in life. And anything that stops that from happening is what I will challenge, because I go, it's not my right to make a decision how a young person will decide.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes a lot of sense. So one of the things that I kind of wanted to, I guess, sort of get towards wrapping this chat up on was just to sort of ask you, you've been sitting at the head of schools for a while now, and the world's changed a lot since during that time, everything from the iPhone to the internet at large, and even our schools have physically changed a lot, and there's been a lot of policy shifts and all that in between.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to sort of say, like, from your perspective, what do you think has changed that actually is going to have an actual real positive impact for students? Or what do you think, I guess also, or the flip side of that is, what do you think's still the same thing that despite all this change, we really need to keep focusing on?
Remembering. Look, there's a number of ways you can answer this question. Overwhelmingly, children remain children. And just because they act as if they know what's going on, they actually don't have a clue. And you can cover that from anything. It's like, they're so much more sexually aware. I'm like, yeah, kind of, but not really. Like they have these views about things, and sometimes that's true, but by and large, children are children. And wisdom is a real thing. Wisdom is different than being clever. And there are a lot of very clever kids out there, but ultimately they're still children, which is why when things go wrong, you never, ever get to point a finger at a child and say, but they led me on, or but they did this, or but they said that. It's like, that no one has that right. They are still children. And so I think it's very easy to get tricked into thinking they know more than they think they do. And I'm not saying you want to keep them, feeling young, but you have to recognise that they are just little people doing the very best they can. And when things go wrong, I remind myself, actually with staff as well as with kids, that none of them wake up in the morning, put their foot on the floor and go, how can I screw up today? How can I get every teacher grumpy with me? How can everything go wrong? Like, they just don't. They want to be loved, they want to be seen, and they want to be heard. And that's the same way it's always ever been, And as you get older, you get a little more like, well, actually, I don't need to be seen by everybody. Just these people really matter to me. The rest, I'm not as fussed about them. But when you're a little person, it really matters that they are seen and heard and loved and protected. And I don't think that's changed.
Yeah, I think it's really lovely to hear, especially like when we think of principals as well, that your day-to-day job is, caught up in policy and parents and finances and all those kinds of fun stuff that I'm sure you love desperately and, would love to get back to right now. But
Yeah.
but it's lovely to hear you talk about kind of that sense of joy and that this is, still fundamentally about, one kid trying to do the right thing and us trying to give them the best shot.
Absolutely. And allowing them to change, just because they did something jerky in year 8 doesn't mean they're like that forever, and I think sometimes as adults we're like, well, this is the way they are. It's like, what do you mean? Like, I've changed more in the last 5 years than I ever did between 10 and 15, they're changing and we're changing, and giving people a benefit of the doubt. That's not being soft. That's not walking away from, I say, the morals and values, but it's just understanding that humans are really just trying to do the best they can.
Well, speaking of, what would you say to your 10 years ago self that you know now that you what wisdom would you impart?
10 years ago, I think I probably would have spent far too much time worrying that I was I think one of the challenges with teachers, and I'm absolutely no exception, is that we want to save the world, and we want everyone to be happy, and we don't like confrontation and we don't like conflict. And we're teachers, right? I mean, life is good, and I think. Any time a child would leave the school, I'd beat myself up about something. What didn't I do, or couldn't I have done, or someone didn't like me, and I'm like, oh no, and I look at it now, and I just think you can't save everyone in every situation. And I remember listening to this High Court judge lady talking about what it's like to be in the appeals court at the family court, which is pretty full-on environment.
Oh yeah, they get some interesting cases there.
It's so heartbreaking.
Rough day at work.
And she said sometimes all you can do is make their life better for 10 minutes, and you just go 10 minutes. You just have to bank that and move on. And that kind of that compromise would have seemed untenable to me early on. Now I go, you know what? I can't make people's decisions for them. It's not my life. I actually don't know what the best thing is for people sometimes, even though I kind of maybe think I do. And so learning how to let that go and just go, same thing, you're just doing the best you can, and it's not always going to be perfect and not everyone's going to agree. But you're still in the arena, right? You're not on the sidelines critiquing or being negative. You're giving it your best shot.
Yeah, I had a great conversation with a principal last year where he said sometimes our job is incredibly complicated and sometimes it's really simple.
Yes.
He said, some weeks you're trying to get the last, sort of few academic percent out of the kids, and other times you're spending a week where you're just trying to keep them alive.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, I think you're right in terms of, you've got to do the best you can with what you got and get up each morning and sort of let the past be the past and
be okay with that.
Step boldly into what you can do today.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a great note to leave us, wrap us up on. One thing that we always do at the end of these is just to sort of, I guess, I think a lot of people, they take the school environment very seriously. It's a professional job as well, but some fun definitely happens along the way. And there's lots of great stories, some of which I'm sure you can't say on a recording, publicly at least. But we generally ask if you've got any sort of quick story or anecdote that was a bit of fun that you could share. For example, Gavin McCormack told us a great story about where he had some chickens in the hatchery. Where unfortunately they didn't go too well.
Yes.
And then he kindly put them off into the trash bin until later one of the kids came in, the primary school kids, and found that the trash bin was chirping.
Yeah.
So.
Oh no, we certainly have lost an entire batch of chooks and had to explain the life cycle a little earlier than we'd thought. I mean, life is full of very funny moments in schools, and a lot of them are laughing with kids about what they think is funny and what they, and so I can't instantly kind of think, oh, well, here's a great example of something. But I do appreciate the little joys that don't necessarily translate into a story, but they translate in knowing someone and being able to give a child a hug or a high five and go, well done, and watching children engage in things they couldn't have done and watch them do it and go, they nailed it. So I can't think of any instantly funny stories, but I I mean, all the stuff that I can think of is embarrassing. Like when I sat on a chair at awards day in front of 2,500 people and the entire chair just sunk really slowly, and it was one of those things where I should have leapt to my feet and just gone, oh, the chair's broken, but I didn't. So I just let the whole thing lower in front of everybody until I was on the stage. All of those things you just try and put out of your mind. But the great joys are the little stories with the kids as you go along, and I wouldn't replace them for anything.
No, well, that's probably a good excuse then to get you back on the podcast at some point in the future when we can grab a story from you with a bit more preparation. Won't put you on the spot next time. Thanks so much for the chat. It's been absolutely great fun, and I think there's lots of information out there for everyone to sort of dive in, whether you're a teacher in your classroom every day or heading up to a leadership position like yourself.
Yeah, I would if I could leave one message with people who are involved in education, in that the world is full of critics, and it's really easy, particularly if you're on social media or you're kind of out there, to give equal weight to the commentary. And I think that idea that you have to have an inner core or an inner strength or an inner foundation that you go, you know why you're here, you know what you're doing, hold on to that, and keep walking the walk. It's a hard walk, it's a challenging. We're playing a really long game, and there's not a lot of instant glory, like a lot of the stuff that I do now, I'm not going to know, well, I'll probably never hear about the benefits of it, but they will be when they're in their 40s and their 50s and they're making life decisions based on the values and the character that they're imbued with as children. It's very hard in that kind of environment sometimes to hold strong to what you know to be true, And I would encourage them to, because I think when you go out in the public and out in the world, everyone's been to school, everyone's a critic, everyone's, got the answers.
The 2 cents worth.
Yeah, 2 cents worth. But just, you know what you're doing. You're in the arena, and all power to you.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And if anyone else listening out there, thank you for joining us as well. If you'd like to listen to more of these episodes, you can check out our main site at getatomi.com, or you can listen across Spotify, Apple, and all your other favorite podcast applications. So that's thanks from me, and thanks from Briony Scott.
Thank you so much. Thank you.